परम पवन जी आ ही रहे हैं, आप लोगों से आग्रह है कि आप अपने स्थान पर मौन भाव से खड़े हो जाएं और जब तक वो अपना आसन ग्रहण न करें आप न बैठें, लेकिन बिल्कुल मौन भाव से।
One, two, three. 1, 2, 3. Check, 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 check. So today, 89.5. 89.5. So this is today here at this very sacred place where the Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, after visiting his mother in the heaven, the realm, returned to the world, and we are gathered here today for this teaching. I have been here once early in the 1960, and so the local people here have invited me, and therefore I'm going to come here today to thank you for your invitation. And when I was here in 1960, there wasn't much development here in this area. There are more new monasteries, and then also the Youth Buddhist Association has started a library. So which shows of some progress and development in this area going on. So I'm very glad for these, and the concerned people who I would like to thank everyone for your good work. You have worked hard to make some progress and development in this region. So this sacred place related to the Buddha so I would like to also pray for more developments and here in this region, which is a sacred place related to the Buddha. So with regard to the chronological order of the development of or the spread of Buddhism, we have first the Pali tradition, which is the oldest tradition. And so even when the Buddha gave teachings in public, which were taught in Prakriti language, the common people's language, And so the Buddha gave teaching of the Pali tradition, and so today we'll have the recitation of the Pali's Mangalam Sutra in Pali, recited by the Theravada monks. So this is the Mangala Sutra, which says, I have heard that at one time the Blessed One was staying in Savatthi, at Jetha's Grove, another Pentecost monastery. Then a certain Deva, in the far extreme of the night, her extreme radiance lighting up the entire of Jetha's Grove, approached the Blessed One. On approaching, having bowed down to the Blessed One, she stood to one side, and she stood to one side. As she stood to one side, she addressed him with a verse. Many Devas and human beings give thought to protection, desiring well-being. Then, tell them the highest protection. Then the Buddha replied, no, not consorting with fools, consorting with the wise. Paying homage to those worthy of homage, this is the highest protection. Living in a civilized land, having made merit in the past, directing oneself rightly, this is the highest protection. Broad knowledge, skill, well-mastered discipline, well-spoken words, this is the highest protection. Support to one's parents, assistance to one's wife and children, consistency in one's work, this is the highest protection. Living in rectitude, assistance to one's relatives, deeds that are blameless, this is the highest protection. Abstaining from evil, refraining from intoxicants, being heedful of the qualities of the mind, this is the highest protection. Respect, humility, contentment, gratitude, hearing the Dhamma on timely occasions is the highest protection. Patience, compliance, seeing contemplatives, discussing the Dhamma on timely occasions, this is the highest protection. So with regard to the Sanskrit tradition of the teaching of the Buddha, the Prajnaparamita Sutras are the main teachings. And within the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, we have the extensive, the medium length, and the short. And then usually we talk about this 17 different texts, which are termed as the mother and children. So with regard to the Pali, the Sanskrit tradition, of course, it has spread in India, and then we have the other countries in which the Sanskrit tradition has spread, such as China, Korea, Nepal, Vietnam, and so forth. And so we'll... Japan, yeah. So in these Sanskrit, the countries where the Sanskrit tradition has spread, we recite the Heart Sutra. So without reciting the whole Heart Sutra, we'll just have the verse recitation. This is a homage to the mother of all the Buddhas, the perfection of wisdom, which is inexpressible, ineffable, and beyond conception. And then the Heart Sutra mantra. Paragate parasangade buddhi swaha dekagate paragate parasangade buddhi swaha. And then the recitation of, with regard to the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, we have basically two different contents, which are the explicit content of the emptiness, and then the implicit content of the progression along the path. And so in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, what is taught is the basis level of truth, and then the path and the fruition. And the Buddha goes through the different topics, subjects, and then says that all these are empty. And then in the end, he says these are merely in name and imputed. And so in the Pali tradition also, there is the teaching of the Four Noble Truths, and then the 12 links of dependent origination, and also the 37 harmonies to enlightenment, or the factors of enlightenment. And then we go through the path, practice of the path, the cultivation of the path, and then also results that we attain. And so, in other words, the Buddha, what he goes through is the basis level of the truth, reality at the truth basis level, and then the path and the fruition of the path. And so, using them as the subject to establish emptiness, and then the Buddha goes through the progression along the paths and the grounds. And in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And with regard to the commentaries, the commentarial tradition, Master Nagarjuna commented on the explicit content of the Prajnaparamita Sutras in his Mula Madhyamaka Karika and so forth. And then Maitreya Nath commented on the implicit content, which are the progression along the paths and the grounds. And therefore, I recite the verses of salutation from these two texts, Abhisamaya Alamkara by Maitreya and Mula Madhyamaka Karika by Nagarjuna. So, as I usually do that, I will recite them here as well. So, first the verse salutation from Abhisamaya Alamkara, which is through the knowledge of all. You lead hearers to seek peace to perfect peace. Through the knowledge of the path, you enable those who benefit beings to bring about the welfare of the world. Through being endowed with you, the omniscient sages can teach in various ways. Homage to you, Mother of the Buddhas, and of all the hearers and bodhisattvas. And then Nagarjuna's salutation. I prostrate to the perfect Buddha, the best of all teachers, who taught that which is dependent origination is without cessation, without arising, without annihilation, without permanence, without coming, without going, without distinction and without identity, and peaceful, free from fabrications. So with regard to the teaching today, the text that I'm going to go through is the Dhammapada. So I will go through this text and then give short explanations briefly. So this text in Pali, and which is Dhammapada, and then in the Tibetan canonical collection we have the Udana Varga, which also contains different verses. So, although there may be difference in the words, the basic content or is almost same. So, I have received the oral transmission of this Udana Varga, the verses for specific collections of verses or for specific disciples. And so with the Kadampa masters have 6 different texts. So one is the Ujjataka Mala, and the second one is the Udana Varga. And then the third is the Bodhisattva Bhumi, and then the Abhisamaya Alamkara, the Sutra Alamkara, and then the 2 texts by Master Shandideva. And so Bodhisattva Bhumi was written by Master Asanga, and Mahayana Sutra Alankara was written by Maitreya. And then the last two texts are Chandideva's Shiksha Samuchaya, Compendium of Practices, and the Engaging in the Bodhisattva Deeds, the Bodhisattva Charyavatara. And so, in this classic, among these 6 texts, we have these Udhana Varga, the compilation of specific verses. So, in this text, Dhammapada, we find so all that, everything is the nature of the mind, and that the mind is primary and precedes them. And if a man speaks or acts with an evil thought, pain follows him, as the wheel follows the foot of an ox. All that we are is everything is in the nature of a mind, and mind is primary and precedes them all. If a man speaks and acts with a pure thought, and happiness follows him like a shadow that never leaves him. And so, of course, we are engaging here in a Dharma discourse. But when you listen to Dharma discourse, from the side of the teacher and the disciples, from the side of the teacher, for example, one should not have negative or evil motivations, such as seeking name, fame, gaining wealth, and so forth. And so, if you do this, then, of course, if you bear these kind of negative state of mind while giving teaching, you may be accumulating negative karma. And then from the side of the disciples, the audience, you should not think that I will receive this teaching in order that I may be able to have as many oral transmissions or teachings as possible, just to count the number of teachings that you have received, not really integrating them within yourself, or to be able to gain fame or name that you may be able to gain, make your name for yourself or wealth for yourself by giving teaching to others and so forth. So what kind of motivation you should have is the pure motivation, in order to be able to help others and benefit others. And if you expand that thought, you could also think of benefiting all sentient beings. And so with that kind of motivation, you should listen to the teaching on the part of the disciple, the audience, and then on the part of the teacher himself also, one should have that kind of pure motivation of giving the teaching. And therefore, please bear this correct motivation to listen to the teaching, and on my part also, I will bear the correct motivation as well. So what is Dharma, or Chu in Tibetan? So is it something which has actually passed, existed in the past? But today we are in the 21st century, and so what you have to think is whether Dharma actually has any relevance today in the 21st century or not, whether it is something which is needed for us or not. And so Dharma has the connotation of shielding us, or protecting us. So what it protects us from is suffering. So all beings who have the experience of pain and pleasure, the sentient beings, have this natural wish to have happiness and not to have suffering. And therefore, to reduce suffering and to overcome suffering completely is the means, or the Dharma is a means to protect us or save us from this kind of condition or situation. So as I just read the two verses in the beginning of the Dhammapada, which says that the mind is primary. And so what it shows is that if your mind is disciplined, subdued, then there is happiness. Otherwise, there is suffering if your mind is undisciplined. So Dharma does not deal with sensorial pleasure, but it deals with overcoming our negative emotions and the undisciplined states of mind and reducing them, overcoming them. It serves as a means to bring about happiness and overcome suffering. So today, of course, we have lots of great advancements materially, but they are more or less pertain to the physical or sensorial pleasures related with our the sensory perceptions, such as form, sound, and so forth. It doesn't. The material development itself does not give us real happiness, which has to do with our mind. And therefore, by using our mind itself, we should subdue the unruly states of mind and make progress in the gentle qualities of mind, the calmness of mind, and so forth. And therefore, this is what the Dharma does. And therefore, however great progress and developments we may have made in the world today, there are people who have lots of suffering still mentally. And therefore, to deal with this problem, we should find that the Dharma is something which is relevant and which is beneficial as well. Like Yurgul. Radio Lao. No. So how many Tibetans are there in this audience? Please raise your hands. Tibeti. So those who can actually understand Tibetan that I speak, please raise your hands, the Tibetans. So do you actually understand me, the Tibetans? There are, amongst Tibetans, we have people who really speak with a very strong Kamba accent or Amdo accent. And then there's the Western Tibetans from Western area of Tibet, who also have very strong accents. So do you get me? How many of you are there who needs to listen to English translation? Please raise your hands. So, how many of you have this text, the Dhammapada? It seems whoever is responsible for distributing the text have not distributed it. Where is the text? Where are the texts? So the Dhammapada is also printed in Tibetan, and so the Tibetans should get the Tibetan version, whereas the Indians should get the Indian version, the Hindi version. What's this? This translation by Max Miller is not... So when we give the teaching on the Dhammapada, we should have the text. You should have the text. Because otherwise you would listen to the explanation without the text, and then when you get the text, of course there's nobody to explain it. And so that this should not be the case with us. So with regard to the mind, His Holiness is saying that perhaps this book in Tibetan should be distributed to the general public rather than those on stage. We almost kind of know the teaching, and so it's more important to distribute the book to the general public. So in the meantime, while the books are being distributed, I will just go through the introductory teaching, the general teaching. And so depending on whether your mind is disciplined or not, then you have happiness or suffering. Even for non-believers, for example, like scientists and also health workers. So people now, these people are now becoming more aware of the mind, peace of mind, because they see that if you have more peace of mind, then there is, as individuals you are happier, and you are happier as families as well. Without the peace of mind, you may not have, you will not have happiness, but then fear, anxiety, competitive feelings, and jealousy, and so forth will be rife. You'll be rife with this, and then there's disturbance of mind that we can see, don't we? And so, from even amongst those non-believers today, there are people who see the importance of our mind, the peace of mind. So I've been meeting with many different people since I came into exile, and for the last 30 years I have had discussions with scientists, many discussions with scientists, and therefore from these what I can actually sum up is that even amongst the people, non-believers, there are people who see the importance of disciplining our mind, gaining peace of mind. And now, with regard to disciplining our mind, for those who have no particular religious faith, then the secular ethics, which is an Indian, ancient Indian tradition, is very relevant. So in the Western countries, for example, in the West, the term secularism has this connotation of disrespect to religions and staying distant from, or distancing oneself from the religions. But in the Indian context, even the Indian constitution uses the term secularism. So, therefore, this term has the connotation of respect to all religions and even the non-believers. So this is something that we, in this world where we have 7 billion people, and amongst whom 1 billion are not without any belief of religion. And so this particular tradition of secularity is something which is relevant to the world today, including the non-believers. So generally speaking, those who believe in different religious traditions, there are about 6 billion people following these different religious traditions. And within the believers, there are those who are based on faith to tame one's mind. So all the different religious traditions, such as Buddhism, to go by chronological order in terms of the before Buddhism came into the world, there were other religious traditions, such as in India, the Hinduism and so forth. And then there are, in the Middle East, the Zoroastrianism also spread, which is the earliest kind of religious tradition in the West, perhaps. And then from there came Judaism and Christianity, and then Islam also spread. And then in India, the different Indian traditions, and then later also Jainism, and then Buddhism, and then much later Sikhism developed in India. And so all these religious traditions have the means of faith to tame our mind. But the difference amongst these religious traditions is a philosophical field or philosophical view. So therefore we have theistic religious traditions and non-theistic religious traditions. Those who believe in a creator God and those who do not believe in the creator God. And so amongst those theistic religions, we have mainly the Brahmanic religions of India, which say that ultimately everything comes from the creator God. But then they also have this belief in reincarnation, rebirth as well. Whereas other theistic religious traditions like Judaism, Christianity, they believe in only one lifetime for human beings. And so they don't talk about rebirth, passing from one life through the successive lives. And then the non-theistic religious traditions comprise non-theistic Sankhya school, and then Jainism and Buddhism. And within this camp, we have those who assert a self or Atma, a soul theory, and those, and then Buddhism, which does not, which rejects this idea. And therefore, we have, from the point of view of the philosophical views, we have all these different religious traditions. But despite the difference in philosophical traditions, philosophical views, the purpose of all these teachings is the same. For example, the theistic religious followers of theistic religions say that God created everything, God created us, therefore, and God is infinite love. And therefore, because we are created by such a God who is almighty and have infinite love and so forth, therefore it inspires the people, the followers, to have faith, and then through that faith, based on that faith, they actually go on with the practice of love, compassion, and to help others, altruism, and also for patience or tolerance and forgiveness. And then also the practice of self-discipline. And so the different philosophical views, the aim of all this is to create, to produce a good person. And so in that respect, all religions have the same goal. And then the different philosophical traditions or philosophical views are needed because of the different mental dispositions of different people. So for that reason, the major religious traditions of the world are beneficial and helpful to human beings. And then the philosophical difference in different philosophical traditions also are something which is which works for the specific followers of these different religious traditions as well. And these religious traditions for the last thousands of years have actually benefited human beings, and they are helping human beings today, and even in the future as well. This will continue, and therefore it is very important to for all these religious traditions to be friendly and harmonious. So with regard to these major religious traditions of the world, all these major religious traditions are there in India, settled in India. So all the major religious traditions of the world are there in India, and there has been a harmony amongst all these religious traditions in India, and which is a very good example for the rest of the world for religious harmony. And therefore, wherever I go and talk in the world, I always mention that India is an example of religious harmony, and where all the religious traditions live together and actually respect one another by understanding the other's traditions. And so there is mutual respect. And so on the basis of that mutual respect, these religious traditions kind of share the good things in one another's traditions. And so there is a mutual learning amongst these religious traditions in the world, in India. And therefore, so this religious harmony which exists in India, you should think about it as a treasure of India, and think of actually keeping or preserving this tradition, and to see the importance of this preservation of this tradition. And therefore, the Indians, I would like to ask the Indian brothers and sisters of in the Dharma to actually pay attention to this, to keep this tradition alive. So one of the most important religious traditions of India is Hinduism. So just Zoroastrianism, which evolved or started in Iran or Persia, is about 3,000 years old, and from which came the Judaism and Christianity, and then later Islam. And so we can see there has been some historical development in these religions. Where these different religions have been kind of come up with new ideas as they developed. And then with regard to the Buddhism itself, the Buddha himself has listened to teachings from Indian Hindu masters such as Uddaka, as it is mentioned in Sutra. And then there is that practice of, within the teaching of the Buddha, we have the teaching of the three trainings. The three trainings of morality, and then the training of concentration, which actually consists of developing single-pointed concentration, which are mundane as well as supramundane kind of level of concentration. And then there is the wisdom, that training of wisdom. So this is something which is common to all the Indian, classical Indian traditions. The difference between the Buddhism and the other traditions is the idea or the assertion of self or Atma and the rejection of Atma, where Buddhism rejects it. So apart from that, the practice of cultivating the concentrations of the form and formless realms, as well as the three trainings, basically are common to the Indian classical Indian traditions. So many people actually misunderstand what is meant by anatma theory, thinking that anatma means that there is no self at all whatsoever. But what is actually being rejected in the anatma or soulless theory, non-soul theory, is the rejection of a permanent, single and autonomous self. So perhaps I can say this here. In the Pali tradition also, Pali text, scripture, there is this mention of this self, the notion of self being devilish mind, and that is the source of all distorted views. It is like the mother, or which gives rise to all the different distorted views, which do not have real support of good reason to assert it. And so all these different distorted views or wrong views are based on this notion of a permanent, single, autonomous self. And then the scripture goes on to say that because this whole the composition factor, or the compounded factors, or the five psychophysical aggregates are empty, and therefore there is no self. So it doesn't mean here that the self is not at all existent, but what it means is that the self, which is permanent and so on and so forth, is rejected. But then the scripture goes on to say that just as a chariot is designated on the basis of its parts, likewise a person is designated on the basis of his or her psychophysical aggregates. And therefore there is no self which is like a controller of the psychophysical aggregates, but the self is designated based on the psychophysical aggregates, the five aggregates, And so there is no substantially discrete, substantially existing self, nor a self which is like a governor of the psychophysical aggregates. So what is not rejected is the conventionality of self, but a self which is permanent, permanent, single, and autonomous is rejected. So in the non-Buddhist texts, or Hinduism, we may say, so the difference between Hinduism and Buddhism is mainly the idea or the assertion of Atma, or rejection of it. So even in Hinduism, there is the practice of Tantra, where the practitioners visualize the chakras, the 5 chakras, and then the practice of sadhanas. So there is the practice based on the prana, energy, and also the vital fluid, and then the channels and chakras and so forth. And then also there is the practice of projecting or the mind out of the body, as well as transferring the consciousness into another body. And so in Hinduism, and so there are many practices which are common to Buddhism in Hinduism. So the difference lies in the acceptance or the rejection of the Atma. So with regard to the teaching of the Buddha, as I said before, Pali tradition came first. The earliest is Pali tradition, and then the Sanskrit tradition also came into being. So if we look at the scriptures that we have, the Vinaya, the monastic discipline, which teaches, which mentions the 4 root traditions, have the Vinaya Sutra, Patimoksha Sutra, there is, which is in Pali, and then there is also the Patimoksha Sutra in the Mula Sarvastivada tradition. So with regard to the Vinaya tradition, generally speaking, we have the same kind of practice of how to preserve, how to keep one's monastic vows, and also if you go against the certain vows, how to actually recover it or rectify the mistakes and so forth. And then we have also the scriptures which teach concentration, single-pointed concentration, and also the concentrations are of the concentration formal realms and formless realms, and also the and so there are, in other words, many common teachings, that the teachings which are common to both the Sanskrit and Pali traditions, but the difference is in the Abhidharma tradition. We usually mention in the Tibetan tradition the higher Abhidharma and the upper and lower Abhidharma tradition. So there is the Abhidharma teaching or the texts which are taught, which are there in both the Sanskrit and the Pali traditions, and then the Abhidharma, which is found only in the higher or the upper Abhidharma tradition, as mentioned in the Abhidharma Samuccaya. So the Pali tradition has spread in these different countries: Thailand, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Laos, Burma. And then the Sanskrit tradition spread to China and other countries that I mentioned before. So in these Sanskrit places where Sanskrit tradition has spread, there is the practice of Vinaya, the monastic discipline, and so as the basis of one's practice, and then the Sanskrit teachings of the Sanskrit traditions are called added to that and additional to this. So of course there we have the terms like Mahayana, Hinayana, but if you don't really understand the real import of these words, what they actually indicate or connote, then sometimes we get the idea that when the Mahayana or when we use the term Hinayana, it is something which is like a view where you have where you look down upon the practitioners of the non-Mahayana tradition. But we have to know that the basic teachings which are found in the Pali tradition are fundamental to the Buddhist tradition, and so which are common to both the Pali and Sanskrit traditions. So during the first turning of the wheel of the Dhamma, the Buddha gave teaching on the Four Noble Truths, so which is like a big framework of Buddhism in general. Sometimes when people say that they are doing tantric practice, they do all kinds of misbehavior, engage or indulge in all kinds of misbehavior, which actually is the misuse of tantra, misusing tantra, and so without having the fundamental practices within yourself, then the tantra could be used in the wrong way. So one could actually be led astray by through tantric practice. So the three trainings and the Vinaya, particularly the Patimoksha practice of Patimoksha or the individual liberation precepts, are fundamental for the Mahayana practitioners. And then you add on to that the understanding of the bodhicitta and so forth, and also we add the understanding of selflessness, within which there are degrees of subtlety. For example, the Chittamatra view is grosser than the Madhyamaka view of selflessness. So with regard to the teaching of the Buddha, we have the three vehicles, Shravaka, Pratyeka Buddha, and the Bodhisattvayana, when we actually make the distinction within the teaching of the Buddha from the point of view of the skillful means or method, and then from the point of view of philosophical views or the wisdom side, we may make the distinction between the four different schools of thought, such as the Vaibhashikas, the Sutantikas, Chittamatra, and Madhyamaka. So, with regard to the Sanskrit tradition, the scriptures in Sanskrit tradition, for example, the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom teachings, of course, which these were not taught by the Buddha in public, but for beings who have some pure vision or pure karma, for them these teachings of the perfection of wisdom were given. And so amongst this audience for the perfection of wisdom teachings, we have the gods, non-gods, Asuras and Gandharvas and humans, and also deities like Manjushri, Samandabhadra, Avalokiteshvara and so forth. And so this indicates that it was not, these teachings were not taught in public. So before the time of the Master Nagarjuna, there were people who had actually said that Mahayana was not teaching of the Buddha. And therefore, Master Nagarjuna and his followers like Bhavivek and Shantidev and so forth have actually argued for Mahayana being the teaching of the Buddha. And even today we have people who reject Mahayana being the teaching of the Buddha. And then the Sanskrit scripture, within the Sanskrit literature, we have the texts like by Nagarjuna, Aryadev, Buddha Palit, Chandrakirti, so they have written texts which are excellent in the Sanskrit tradition. So we can actually, these are texts which are extant for us to see today. The style of writing in these texts in Sanskrit is actually considered a very high level of Sanskrit, the style of writing. So in these texts by these masters, what they touch or go through are the three trainings, the morality training of morality, concentration, and wisdom, and particularly with regard to the wisdom part of the training, they have actually emphasized reason rather than resorting only to the scriptural authority of the Buddha. As the Buddha himself has actually said, O monks and scholars, just as the gold is tested by rubbing, cutting, and burning, likewise you should examine my teaching, and accept them through one's examination and through experiment and reason, and then accept them, and not because you have devotion to me. And so, accordingly, these masters have actually checked which texts can be actually taken or accepted literally, and which should not be taken literally. But although they were taught by the Buddha, if they don't actually stand up to the test of reasoning, then they should not be taken or accepted literally. And therefore, they have used reason to establish which texts can be taken literally and which cannot be taken literally. And therefore, in the Nalanda tradition, using reason and logic, they have established the ground, or the basis, path, and the fruition. And therefore, because of emphasis on logic and reasoning, we have texts written by Dignaga and Dharmakirti, for example, on the epistemology. And so Dignaga wrote his text, and then Dharmakirti wrote his commentary teachings on texts on that, Dignaga's text. Dharmakirti's texts are sevenfold. Three are considered the main body, called the primary texts, and then the other four are like derivation from them. So with regard to the text on epistemology written by Dignaga, except for Pramana, the door of logic by Dignaga, there is no other translation of text on logic in China, in Chinese. Now, with regard to this, the epistemology, the tradition, we have the complete text in the Tibetan tradition. So His Holiness is looking at chapter 20, looking at the book published by the Tibetan Library of Tibetan Works and Archives on page 57. which is the chapter on the section of path, chapter on path. So the text says the best of the ways is all created things perish. He who knows and sees this becomes passive in pain. This is the way to purity. All created things are grief and pain. He who knows and sees this becomes passive in pain. This is the way that leads to purity. All forms are unreal. He who knows and sees this becomes passive in pain. This is the way that leads to purity. So I think His Holiness read these 3 verses. And then the Tibetan text distributed by the Buddhist Youth Association here, the organizers have published it, which you have. It's on page 41. The Tibetans. So verse number 5. So why I'm mentioning these verses is because in the beginning of the Dhammapada, it says that everything is in the nature of mind, and because it shows that whether you have happiness or suffering depends on whether you actually have unruly mind or a tamed mind. And therefore, in order to have a tamed mind, you cannot just make prayer. Many of us actually say, I pray to the 3 jewels that my unruly mind may be tamed. But what has to happen is actually, what you have to know is that the mind is impermanent. It changes momentarily. So all composites, all compounded phenomena are impermanent. It says in the verse 3, all compounded phenomena are impermanent, and if with wisdom one sees it, then one is not overcome by suffering. And this is the pure path of purity. And so the basis of Buddha's teaching is the understanding of the 4 points of permanence, impermanence, and suffering, nature of things, and then that things are empty or absence of any purity, and then the absence or the selflessness. And so impermanence, suffering, and the selflessness are basic to the teaching of the Buddha. And so within impermanence, we can talk about a grosser level, which we can actually, the obvious changes which are perceptible to us. Whereas the subtle impermanence is so, for example, we can see the obvious changes in a year, the 4 seasons. So these 4 seasons, I mean, there is change in the 4 seasons because of the change in the different months. And so even within, without there being a change, within a month, you cannot see a change in the year. And the month, within the month, you have the day, the weeks, and then the days, and then hours, minutes, and seconds, and so forth. So without there being changes in every phase of these times, you cannot see the impermanence, the obvious changes. And even in science, when in science you see some sparks of light, and so you can see the atomic level, on the atomic level, changes going on, even at the subatomic levels. So when you actually go down to the subatomic levels, you can see this momentary change in everything. And therefore the Buddha says everything that is compounded is impermanent. And so why there is this impermanence and the change? For some abrupt changes, you of course need to have some external third force to cause that change, whereas the momentary change is possible just because of the cause which brings about the result. And therefore, although we may think that the arisal and the disintegration or destruction of something may be not simultaneous, but if you go into the subtle level of change on the subatomic levels, you can see that whatever is created is destroyed momentarily. And so they are simultaneous. Whereas because of our clinging to some permanence in self, we also have this clinging to permanence in things which are impermanent, and clinging to some kind of a pleasantness in things which are in the nature of suffering, and clinging to some kind of a purity where there is the uncleanliness, and then the clinging to some kind of a selfhood where there is selflessness. And so what is the root of all these problems that we have is those of attachment and anger or hatred. So when we see things which are pleasant or unpleasant, we tend to think that pleasantness and unpleasantness in the things are something which is permanent. But we have to understand, if you check carefully, that they are also in the nature of change and impermanence, and therefore the Buddha teaches impermanence of things. Of course, the Buddha's body and Buddha's speech are also impermanent. But here, when we are dealing with impermanence in the teaching of the Buddha here, we are dealing with the impure things within samsara. And therefore, the impermanence, the momentary change is happening because of its causes. And therefore, the psychophysical aggregate, the impure psychophysical aggregates that we have are impermanent. And the change, because of that, the change is happening because of its causes, which comes down to that of ignorance. So ignorance about the fundamental reality of things. And therefore, we talk about ourselves suffering because we are under the force of or influence of our negative emotions. And then all the negative emotions are rooted in ignorance. And so within ignorance, there is this mere not knowing the reality, and then a distorted view of reality. And so the later one is the main cause. And so when we understand that our perceptions, the wrong perceptions, are because of negative emotions, are because of this kind of wrong perception, the ignorance which distorts reality, then we can see that we are actually under some kind of unjust cause, under the influence of an unjust cause, which is this distorted ignorance. And therefore, in Dharmakirti's Pramana Vartika, he says that because of that, based on the teaching of impermanence, the Buddha leads us to the understanding of suffering. And through that, the teaching, the Buddha leads us to the understanding of selflessness. And so the text says, all created things perish. He who knows and sees it with wisdom actually becomes passive in pain. This is the way to purity. And then the next two verses. Actually, this verse shows that things are impermanent, and then the next verse, verse number 6, shows that things are in the nature of suffering, and then the 7th verse shows that the things are in the nature of selflessness. So the verse number 3 in the Tibetan translation says, all phenomena are without self or selfless. And those who understand or sees this with wisdom will not be overcome by or suffering. And this is the path of purity. Max Muller's translation reads, all forms are unreal. He who knows and sees this becomes passive in pain. This is the way that leads to purity. The translations. Forms unreal. It says Chö Tamje. So after he became enlightened, the Buddha, for the time being, refrained from giving teachings. He said that I have found this nectar-like teaching, which is very peaceful, profound, peaceful, and without elaboration, which will not be actually understood by anybody if I taught it. Therefore, I will remain in the forest. And so, right after his enlightenment, he didn't. So, of course, if it were the case that it could be taught to the public, to the people, he would have gone forth to teach them right away. But because it was difficult, because of the circumstance at that time was such that nobody actually talked about or accepted this kind of teaching of which is profound, peaceful, and without any reification, which is very difficult to gain knowledge into. And I found this, and therefore, if I taught it, it would be not understood by others. Therefore, he stayed alone. And later on, gods like Indra, Brahma, and so forth came to him to request to give teaching. And therefore, the Buddha gave teaching on the Four Noble Truths, saying that this is the noble truth of suffering, this is the noble truth of origin, this is the noble truth of cessation, and this is the noble truth of the path. And then he also went on to teach on the Four Noble Truths from the point of view of their functions. He said that suffering must be known, origin must be overcome, the cessation must be actualized, and the path must be cultivated. And then with regard to the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha also gave the 16 attributes for each of the Four Noble Truths. Such as the 4 attributes of the cause. Suffering are impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and then selflessness. And then the 4 attributes of the origin are called the cause, the source of all, or the origin, and then the thorough cause, and then the condition. And then with regard to the cessation, the 4 attributes are cessation, peace, excellence, and the definite emergence. And then the path are called the path, awareness, or practice, and the means to definite emergence. So, having mentioned these Four Noble Truths and the 16 attributes, now here, first of all, we have the suffering of hunger. So we need to take meal, therefore we'll break here for lunch and then continue with the teaching in the afternoon.